Hello, everybody, and I want to say a huge thank you and a welcome to our international people today. I have found that we have had amazing support now that we have switched authors online to an online platform, and I think that it is amazing just how much diversity we have within our own members now. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you for everyone's support from all over the world. And you'll notice that we have got a new time so that it makes it a little bit easier for our US and our UK members to jump on without it being something ridiculous like 2 o'clock in the morning. So thank you and welcome to everybody for coming today. And please keep yourself on mute. You don't have to have your video on. It's a freezing 15 degrees Celsius here in Brisbane. So I am all rugged up because I hate being cold. Yeah, if you've got jammies on and you're not video ready, please don't feel like you have to put your video on when we switch to the Q&A session. In the Q&A session, I will be checking the chat and answering any questions that you have. So as we go along, if there are any questions that pop up, please, you're welcome to either wait until our Q&A session or just type them in the comments as you go. And what I'll do is at the end, I'll actually go back and make sure. Megan, you know what I'm talking about. I'm in Brisbane and I'm freezing. Oh my gosh. Yeah, side story before I start. We're actually going to Tasmania in a couple of weeks and I had a look and it's minimum 6 degrees, maximum 10 degrees in Hobart today. And I don't know how I'm going to survive, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll get through it. Okay, let's get started because I've got heaps of stuff that I wanted to share with you today. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and the culture of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this nation. And here in Australia, I am coming to you from Manduraba country. So let's get going. So for those of you who know me, you would have seen this before, but these are a sample of my picture books. Even though now I am diversifying into other genres, picture books is where I started. It's what gave me the confidence, I guess, to start looking at diversity and inclusion because I saw that there was such a need for it. You can see just by looking at all of the different titles here that I don't tend to stick with one type of story. I do have a lot of different stories, a lot of different subjects. Something that I was talking to somebody the other day that they found quite interesting was that I am published by a lot of different publishing companies. And that's something that we're going to talk about in another webinar about how you choose publishers and whether you should stick with one publisher and kind of how that all works. But you can see here that what I write already is quite different and lots of different illustrators, lots of different publishers. And there's really not been in the beginning a structure for me to do that. It was kind of just whatever story I was writing at that moment, I would write and submit. But now that I'm a little bit more experienced, I wouldn't say I know what I'm doing, but I'm definitely a lot more savvy than I used to be. And I'm really starting to think about the content that I'm creating and the content that I am submitting to publishers for publication. And that's something that I wanted to focus on today. So there's a lot of us, and I know even people on this call who do either have a disability or have friends and family with disability or work within the disability space. And in my opinion, and again, anything that I tell you guys is very much based on my own life, my own experience. I would never say anything to you that I hadn't had a personal experience of. I really don't think that there is enough diversity and inclusion in the children's picture book industry at the moment. It's definitely a lot better than what I started. These are my stickers. So the fact that I am focusing on trying to do diversity and inclusion content within all areas of what I do now, not only picture books, but also screenwriting, chapter books, middle grade YA. The fact that I'm still getting stickers lets me know that I'm on the right track. I'm still on the right track, especially in the script writing space. I think there is a growing awareness that there has to be more content that involves diversity and inclusion. But I think the industry itself is just a little bit confused about how that happens. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit today. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the origin of children's stories. So children's stories were never written down. They were told to children by their fireside. They were usually after a long day of work. Potentially it could be winter and they were inside and they were stuck. And so it was originally just an oral storytelling tradition. And a lot of the original children's stories were warnings. So they were very much about teaching children how they should act or who they should be, especially women. And this is something that I've done a lot of research into for some things that I'm working on. But if you have a look at a lot of the traditional children's stories, they had a lot of natural diversity inclusion in them, and they all had a moral. They all had a child-friendly message to them. Some of them weren't even that child-friendly. Some of them were actually really scary, and but that's what they were designed to do. So, you know, things like Cinderella, if you work hard and you put up with lots and lots of rubbish, you will have a Prince Charming come and rescue you, and then you get to do all that cooking and cleaning for him. How exciting. Or things like Beauty and the Beast was originally a picture book, oral storytelling, and then turned into a written word and then into a picture book. But originally it was about arranged marriage and getting young girls used to the fact that the person that they would be paired with potentially could be a lot older and maybe not someone that they were necessarily attracted to. And even the research around Little Mermaid was very much around a subconscious preparation for girls that if they wanted to get a husband, then they would have to give up their freedoms and potentially change themselves to make them more appealing to their husband. So we could go into a big feminist rant, but we're not going to. But basically, I want you just to think about the origins of children's stories. And they were never designed originally to be fart books or, you know, books with bums in them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've just written a manuscript that's a fart book, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where it came from. But you've got to remember that children's stories were always meant to be about diversity and inclusion. It was only when they started illustrating them that we got lost along the way. So a lot of the original fairy tales didn't have illustrations. So they were in big books that were read to the children, and then the children would imagine in their own head what was happening. It wasn't actually until the invention of books and the invention of especially color printing that we started putting faces to these children's stories. And then a lot of the faces took that diversity away. And that's just what happened. It was a product of the time. But what it tells to me is that stories are a product of their time. And if it's the time right now for us to be focusing on diversity and inclusion, then it's possible. So even if we look now at a lot of the censorship that's happening with stories, the picture up the top there on the left-hand side is I can remember this story from when I was little, and pop in the comments if you're my vintage and you remember this story, but it was based on a German fairy tale where parents would tell their children that if they didn't stop sucking their thumb, then the tailor would come with big scissors and chop off their thumb so that they couldn't suck their thumb anymore. Like, you know, that's the type of story that we grew up with. And, you know, has that made us I shouldn't use myself as an example, but did that really do a lot of damage psychologically to us? You know, we've got all the Dr. Seuss membership. We've got Laura Ingalls Wilder having all of her awards taken away from her. We've got Enid Blyton being banned or names changed. So I guess what I want you to get out from that is that printed books, especially illustrated printed books, are an interpretation of society at that moment in time. So there's nothing to say that we can't reinterpret what has happened in the past, because it happens all the time. And we just need to make sure that we're doing it in a really socially responsible way. And the way we do that as authors is focus on stories with heart. Focus on stories that our readers have a personal connection to, and stories that make a social or emotional connection with the reader. These three things are really important, not only because they make an awesome picture book, but because this is the type of content that modern kids are looking for. So those kids who grew up sitting by the fire and listening to stories about girls sweeping and cooking and cleaning, and or, you know, the stories about all of the social unrest that was happening at the time, bundled up into a kid-friendly version of some older book. Those kids aren't the same kids that are sitting down on iPhones these days. So we need to adapt to the world that we live in. And iPads and iPhones aren't going anywhere. The internet's not going anywhere. We shouldn't be fighting against that. We should be using that as a tool and working with that and making books that are an absolute viable option, that are an alternative to being on the screen. And we're not going to do that unless we are making awesome stories that these modern kids can see themselves in. And for those of you, I know some of you are listening who are going out and doing school visits or have kids of your own or are around young kids, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And feel free to pop your experience or your opinion in the comments, but we need to be able to connect with these kids on their level. And they are already so much more socially and emotionally aware about inclusion and diversity than we are, because we are the product of our generation. So if we're going to be writing books for them, we've almost got to come up to where they are, instead of thinking that we need, to talk down to them, which is very much where children's books have been in the past. So we've all really struggled over the last 18 months. I wanted to acknowledge just how hard it's been for everybody, not only in our community, but anyone in the creative community have really struggled during COVID. And I think back to this picture on the left-hand side, which is of me in 2019, and I just been appointed as ambassador for my local area. And I can remember that, I had trips planned to Ireland and Singapore and US and Scotland, and I was just so excited to have found a point in my career where I was actually feeling like maybe I was getting somewhere. And then, of course, everybody's world came crashing down. Everything got cancelled, and we really had to reassess how we do things and what we do and where we do them. And everything moved online. For me, it took me probably about a good 2 to 3 months for me to get my head around that. But what it also did is gave me a huge opportunity to reassess not only how I was doing what I was doing, but why and what I was doing. The type of content that I was writing, I now realized that I had to write global content, because even though we're stuck here in Australia, everything's gone online. And so all of a sudden I'm doing Zoom calls like with these kids here in Canada, or, Singapore, or kindy kids over in an English speaking school in China, in Japan, in New Zealand, in outback Australia. So it really was an eye-opener for me that not only did we have to change how we're doing things, but we need to make sure that we are providing content for a global audience, and that can still be regional, so you can still bring your own regional flavor to it, because I'm always going to write what I know. So a lot of it comes from where I live here in Southeast Queensland, and where I grew up, in nature and animals. Like, that's always going to play a part of it. But the message that we're sending, it has to be global. And part of that is making sure that we have got that diversity and inclusion, so that kids all over the world can actually feel like they see themselves in what you're writing. So the first example I wanted to give you was Noah Chases the Wind. Now, this is my beautiful friend, Noah. Noah is the nephew of one of my best friends, and I met Noah when he was little. And I can remember it was a very windy day, and Noah was standing outside, and he was flicking his fingers. So he was rubbing his fingertips together. And I said, Noah, what are you doing? And he said, oh, there's a storm coming. And I looked up, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, but as soon as he said that, this wind whipped up, and he just kind of looked at me with this smile, like, I told you so. And it just planted this seed in my head of Noah. And Noah is autistic, and he is one of the most caring and courageous and smartest little kids I know. So I was really passionate about writing this story, Noah Chases the Wind. I submitted this. This was probably, I'd published probably about 6 or 7 books here in Australia by that stage. And I'd also published one in the US. And I could not find an Aussie publisher who would take it, because they all loved the story, but they said, we just want to take the autistic aspect out of it, because we feel that there isn't a big enough target market having the main character so obviously autistic. Now, the word autistic is never mentioned in the story anywhere, but you can tell, I guess, from how Noah is and what he does and how he processes things that he is autistic. And that was a really important element of the story for me, because I usually write stories about kids I know. And a lot of the stories that I write are inspired by real life kids, even if I do maybe turn them, with a little bit of imagination icing into something a little bit different. So I just wanted to, I guess, emphasize that there might not always be a huge market for what you're writing, but if you are passionate about the story, you need to go into bat for it. You need to stick with it, and you need to find a way for it to be heard. So I looked overseas, and I submitted to a couple of publishers in the US, and I had one publisher take it up, quite a small publisher in the US who was just experimenting with children's books. Usually they printed more adult books or nonfiction books about autism, and they picked it up. And Noah Chases the Wind has been to date my most successful picture book in terms of not only profit but also reach. Noah Chases the Wind in America has been read at the Met during story time, in New York during lockdown. It's been listed on countless websites as a top 10 picture book for autism or understanding kids on the spectrum. A lot of teachers use it in the classroom. And for me, if I had not pursued that avenue of thinking, well, everyone in Australia said that I couldn't write about a book with the main character being autistic, then I wouldn't have had all of that amazing success that Noah has brought me. So sometimes I think you've just got to go with your gut, and if you are passionate enough about a story that has a main character who is not mainstream, then you need to go for it. So my brother Tom, for those of you who know my family, I have 3 boys and they're all preemie babies. Tommy, my youngest boy, being our most preemie baby, born at 28 weeks. And if you have ever been in that situation where you have had a baby in intensive care, you know how just absolutely helpless and useless you feel sitting there. And we had amazing support from Life's Little Treasures Foundation, which is an Australian organisation which doesn't receive any funding from the government. Everything is fundraising. And with my 3rd Bubba going through NICU and special care, you'd think it would have got easier, but it didn't. It was really hard, Tommy being the sickest of the 3, and just the amazing support we received for them. And I really wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to give back. And what can I do? I'm just a picture book author. How can I help? And that's where the idea for My Brother Tom came, which is a picture book for older brothers and sisters of babies who are born premature, because they're promised. Like, it's not, what I realized third time around is it's not just me who misses out on the whole, promise of a beautiful birthing experience. Big brothers and sisters are promised that they're going to get this cute little chubby baby to play with, and they're going to have all the attention because they're big brother or sister. And then all of a sudden everyone's crying and upset. Mum's never home, she's always at the hospital. Everyone's worried, they're not allowed to touch it when they go to the hospital. It's cold and it's clinical, and everybody has to be quiet, so they miss out on the experience as well. And there was no books at that time that I could find that dealt with premature birth, which is surprising when you think that the statistics now say that 1 in 20 kids in an Australian classroom, it's even less than now, I think it's 1 in 18 kids in a classroom were preemie babies. So where is their representation? Where is their birth story? So that, again, was something that I, having learnt from Noah, went to a smaller publisher with, and somebody I knew, somebody who knew me, and we had a conversation about it, because I said, I know there's not a huge market for this. I know this potentially won't be super profitable, but I know there's a need for it. And can you help me? And they saw it too. They saw that it wasn't just about the money. It was about getting books out there that kids needed to read. And it was a beautiful experience working with them on this project. And now, you know, Tommy and I are now ambassadors for Life's Little Treasures Foundation, and every preemie baby in Australia gets a copy of My Brother Tom through the Life's Little Treasures Foundation. So again, it's going into bat for things that you believe. And Yellow Dress Day is an example of, it doesn't have to be in your face kind of stuff. Yellow Dress Day is an example of a character who is nonverbal, but you don't actually realize that she's nonverbal because it's not explicitly said anywhere in the book. Kind of like Noah, except Noah, it's a little bit more obvious, but Yellow Dress Day, it doesn't actually say anywhere in the book that she's nonverbal, but she uses colors to communicate. So this is an interpretation of a nonverbal girl, and how she uses colors to show how she's feeling. And, you know, everyone has already seen the success of that being read on Play School. And, you know, it's just gone into reprint in Australia, UK, US. So there are ways to get your message across and do it mainstream as well, if that's what you want. I don't think you necessarily have to pigeonhole yourself one way or the other. And it's just about honouring the story. And then we have Super Nicholas. So Super Nicholas, again, was one that I struggled to get published because nobody would have a main character with Down syndrome in Australia. And even to the point where I had a publisher say to me, excuse me, we really love this book. We love it, love the story, but we don't want the illustrations to show that he has Down syndrome. And I said to him, this book is Nicholas's book. This book, I didn't even think it was going to be a book. I just originally wrote this story for Nicholas when he was in hospital to cheer him up. And I'd said to him when he got out of hospital that we would play superheroes, and he could help me do the drawings, and we could have it just as his story. When Nicholas sadly passed away and never came out of hospital, I asked his mum if I could continue on and make that story in memory of him. And she was very supportive, and again shared my frustration that we just struggled to find somebody who would have Nicholas as his character. It had to be Nicholas. It couldn't be anybody else. So that's, I think, why we just making sure my laptop's not going to go off. Okay, yep. So we found a small publisher in the US to take Super Nicholas on, and have had amazing support from everyone, not only here in Australia, but all over with the Down syndrome community, which is such a tight-knit community. The other thing I wanted to share as well, especially for those of you watching who are doing author visits, is to not be scared to reach out to special schools and go and do author visits there as well. I've done lots of author visits at special schools, and you find a way. Like I do exactly the same thing as what I do at traditional schools. It's just finding the right type of communication. So the Wheelchair Adventure was written by 4 kids at Narberthon State Special School, and they are published authors now. It's in the National Library in Canberra, in all of the state libraries, and they are listed as published authors. And this is, I guess, diversity and inclusion from the other end, that we've got to make sure that we're also giving children of all abilities the opportunity to be authors and write their own stories, because that's just as important as them being able to see themselves. The other thing, I guess, when we're talking about inclusion is making sure that we are making our stories accessible to all kids. So Sass and Traz Save the Library is my first chapter book, and it is available ebook, and it has got a version on ebook for kids who are visually impaired. It's also going to be coming out in a dyslexic font version for kids who struggle with traditional fonts. And it's also now in negotiations for coming as an animated series as well. So that would be for making it more accessible to kids who just aren't readers, because we do need to consider that as well. A lot of these kids that we're trying to reach, should they miss out on storytelling because they struggle with reading or because they're not engaged by reading? So that's something to consider as well when you are looking at diversity and inclusion, is to make sure that you are making that story as accessible to all kids as you can. Videos are a great way to be able to do that, you know, even just sharing a snippet of the story and putting it on YouTube, finding other ways to share story as opposed to print books, because sometimes that is really difficult and just not accessible, whether it be inability or financial restraints where they just don't have access to books because there are no books in their home. So that's just something to consider. So what I'm going to challenge you with is, you need to put your hand up. If you want to write books about diversity and inclusion, you need to be ambassadors for that. And I originally had thought for the last couple of years that that groundswell had to come from the buying audience. I thought, if we can get a lot of people who always come to me to say, look, I just can't find a story for kids that, you know, my son's in a wheelchair. There's no stories with kids in a wheelchair, so he never sees himself, or Down syndrome kids, or whoever it is. I thought that publishers would see that there was a need for that because the buying public wanted it, and that would make them change their mind. But it simply hasn't, because there isn't enough of that target audience for publishers to sit up and take notice when they're looking at whether it's a profitable decision to make books with diverse characters. So what I've discovered is it has to come from us. It has to come from authors writing books that have diversity and inclusion in it, that are so freaking awesome that publishers have no choice but to say, I love that story, I want to publish that story. And it is a lot easier in the US at the moment than it is in Australia to do that, because I feel that they are more open to having that diverse content. But I would really love if we, as an Aussie community as well, my fellow Aussie authors, could really put their hand up and say, the type of content that I'm creating is accessible and it is inclusive and I celebrate diversity. And that way, when we are submitting and our publishers are getting so many books that have got so much great diversity inclusion in them, that it's kind of a no-brainer. And they go, all right, well, we need to change, because they're not going to change themselves unless we can give them a good enough financial reason to do so. And if we write awesome books that are going to sell, that's kind of what we need to do. What I would say, though, is there still is a huge push for own voices. It's very difficult at the moment to get books published with a diverse character in it unless you have some sort of connection with that. So not writing diversity for diversity's sake, not sticking, you know, a diverse character in there because you want to tick a box. It has to come from some sort of experience in your own life for that to be authentic and for that to really work. This is really important because kids can sniff a fake a mile away. So when you are going and promoting your book and doing your school visits, you need to make sure that whatever diversity and inclusion is in your story, you can eloquently speak about that with firsthand knowledge, because otherwise kids are going to call you out and it's not going to be great for anyone involved. So when you are thinking about diversity and inclusion, start from a place that you're personally experienced with. Start with what you know. And then if you do want to write a story and you don't have that personal connection, reach out to an organization who is aligned with those specific groups of people and learn about it, educate yourself, because a lot of times I have had manuscripts sent to me that have got diverse characters or are talking about things where they want to include minorities, but because they've written them in such a stereotypical way and they haven't taken the time to actually really get to know what that minority group is and how they live and what it's like, and they're just kind of going on their own bias, that's not something that I can support. I can support helping people who are passionate about diversity and inclusion because they have lived experience, because I can work with that. I can absolutely work with that. And I know a lot of the people who are doing our Write a Picture Book Authors Online course at the moment have chosen to write manuscripts about diversity and inclusion. And I'm so, so proud of that, so proud. And it's something that we talk about in the course as well, is making sure that you are writing from an authentic place. Because at the end of the day, these are our target audience. You know, we can talk about the industry and profit and all of the other icky yucky business side of it until the cows come home. But do I care so much about being a bestseller, or do I determine my success based on the amount of royalties that I receive? No, I don't do that. And I think, you know, and I have had people say to me in the past, oh, that's because you're not a big enough author. You know, you haven't made enough money. Once you start making money, then you know, that's a different story. But I don't think so, because I'm not driven by profit. I'm not driven by royalties. I don't really care where I sit on a bestsellers list. These are the little people that I care about. And I want to make them happy, and I want them to have the opportunity to see themselves in books, and I want them to have the opportunity to learn about other kids who are different than them by reading books. And that's the motivation that you have to go into this with, because if you go into writing picture books with the thought that this is going to make you rich, then it's probably not the right industry. And I had this conversation via Facebook Messenger yesterday with somebody asking me about breaking into the picture book industry and whether it was viable financially or not. And I just said, look, if you're asking me that question, then you're probably not in the right industry, because if you're going into it with that mindset, prepare for disappointment. But you're also not going into it with the spirit of what the industry intends, which is creating amazing content for kids and being accessible to all kids. So For those of you who haven't gone on already, I suggest you go to authorsonline.com.au, and there's some free videos on there. Have a look at the How to Write a Picture Book course. If you are thinking about that you might like to do it, please use the discount code VIP50, and that way you will get the course at 50% off.